So we're going to move on now to some introductions. Want to recognize that there are a lot of task force members with us today. I think we're probably close to 50 or so participating in the meeting. And given the size, we're not going to do individual introductions, but instead we will show a series of slides that contain the names of first the BOEM conveners, but then also the task force members. And we'll start with the elected federal and state officials, and then tribal representatives, state agency and local officials, and then finally federal agency representatives. And I want to invite everyone, there's a full roster with all of the names of all the task force members that's available on the BOEM website. So with that, just want to share on this slide the list of the BOEM conveners. Here, there are many members from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management who are working with regard to offshore renewables in the Gulf of Mexico. I want to highlight some of the folks who are on the screen here who will be playing key roles. Obviously, there's a Director Lefton and a Regional Director Salada, but also want to point out Matthew Wilson, who's the Acting Deputy Regional Director Tashara Matthews, who's the Chief of Emerging Programs, who's working very closely with Idrissa Gubey, who's the Renewable Energy Coordinator, and also the Gulf of Mexico Task Force Coordinator. And we've been working very closely with Tashara and Idrissa to plan this meeting. Also want to point out Doug Jones, who's the Tribal Liaison, Doug Philistrat, who's the Gulf of Mexico Office of Public Affairs lead, Ari Culler from the Office of Environment, and finally Bernadette Thomas, who's with the Office of Leasing and Planning. So moving on to the task force members themselves, we do have a number of elected officials and representatives participating here. Just want to note that we have task force members include U.S. Senators Cassidy and Kennedy. We have Garrett Graves, Congressman Garrett Graves with us today, and we also have representatives from the offices of Congressman Clay Higgins and Steve Scalise as well. We have State Senator Paige Cortez, sorry about the formatting here, and also Patrick McMath. And then finally, we have Representative Joe Orgeron, who's, I believe, a designee for Speaker Clay Shakespeare. From tribal nations participating today, we have Melissa Darden, who's she's the chairman of the Chitimacha tribe, and we also have John Fisher with the Jena Band of Choctaw Indians. From state task force members, we have many task force members representing the state of Louisiana, and I won't go through them all here, but give you a moment to take a look at them. The task force members are representing many of the parishes in Louisiana, several of the cities as well, but also a variety of state agencies. We can take a peek here and again invite folks to get the full list for the roster off of the BOEM website. With regard to other state task force members, you can see here from the state of Alabama, we have representatives from the governor's office, a couple of representatives from the state of Mississippi, and finally as well from the state of Texas. And then our last category of task force members come from federal agencies. Again, we have many agencies represented with members on the task force, and I'll list some of these, but we have the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, Environmental Protection Agency, Department of Defense, Department of Energy, the Federal Aviation Administration, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, the Federal Permitting Improving Steering Committee, agencies, the Marine Mammal Commission, Military Aviation Installation Assurances Siting Clearinghouse, the National Park Service, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, National Marine Fisheries Service within NOAA, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the U.S. Army Regional Environmental and Energy Office, the U.S. Coast Guard, U.S. Department of Transportation, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, U.S. Geological Service, and finally, the U.S. Small Business Administration. So you can see there's a wide variety of different federal agencies who will be supporting and participating in task force discussions. So next I want to do 2 more slides or 3 more slides just covering what we're going to be doing today. So I want to pay a little bit of attention to our agenda. The agenda is really focused on 4 main topics today as we're moving forward. One will begin our next agenda item where we'll spend some time looking at background information and doing some task force orientation. We'll have a number of speakers there. And each of these, they're more like panel discussions. We'll have a number of speakers who will present information, and then we'll pause at the end of a suite of presentations to take clarifying questions from task force members. So the first one is on background information and task force orientation. We'll take a break then, and we'll come back for the second one, which will be updates from some of the states who will be providing an overview of their state renewable energy goals. And then we'll have a final panel in the morning that will be focused on offshore wind jurisdictional authorities and who's responsible for what and what do they do. We'll break for lunch then around 12:25 for an hour, and then come back for the final of these panel presentations. It will be focused on Gulf of Mexico information resources and ocean users. We'll take a break at that point, come back with an overview of process next steps in the task force process, and then we have about a half hour that is agendized for task force discussion. This will be an open discussion, an opportunity for task force members to ask questions to each other or to share comments or reflections on what they will have heard earlier in the day. We'll finish up with some action items and closing remarks, and then the formal task force meeting will adjourn, but we'll move after a 5-minute break at 4 o'clock into a public input opportunity that will last approximately 1 hour. So that's the agenda. In terms of our objectives for the meetings, these are covered on the agenda document, but I want to go over them in a little bit of detail here. There are 4 main things we're trying to accomplish with this meeting. The first is to, in a big picture, facilitate coordination and consultation among the many different federal, state, local, and tribal governments that are participating in the task force regarding offshore wind and renewable energy leasing processes in the Gulf of Mexico. A second key objective is to establish a common understanding of the roles and the future activities of the task force. So this is the first Gulf of Mexico Regional Task Force, and we want to make sure that everyone understands what your roles are and what the process will be like moving forward. For task force members, we'll provide updates to the task force and stakeholders on recent state activities and on information as well. And finally, we'll be providing an opportunity for public input on the topics that are being considered by the task force. We do have some process guidelines finally that we'll invite you all to adhere to and help us to uphold during this meeting. Please help us to honor the agenda and stay on track. We have a fair number of presentations, and so we'll be asking our presenters as well as our task force members to help us keep on track. We want to ask everybody to participate actively and respectfully. We will be using a queue for people with raised hands to manage questions, Q&A, and the discussion as well. So we invite folks to speak in order. As possible, to provide your name and affiliation when you speak. That'll be especially important during the public comment opportunity. And then just for folks in our virtual meeting world, please speak clearly into your mic or your phone so others can hear you, and then please help keep the background noise down. Okay, and finally, I just want to recognize the challenges of doing these large virtual meetings that I know that many of us have been participating in many of these, and we invite everyone's help in making this meeting as productive as we can for everyone.